Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. I'm Mitchell Warren, the director of AVAC, and we're going to get started in just a minute. Apologies for being a few minutes past the hour, but we're just opening up the line and welcoming all of you, and we'll get started in just a minute. But if you are tuning into a webinar on the essential needs for intellectual property agreements and technology transfer in global health equity, you're in the right place. All right, I think maybe in the interest of time, I know we are recording it, and we have a lot of terrific presenters that I think it's probably best that we go ahead and get started as other people join, because I'm the least important part of the conversation, and hopefully others will join in time for our presentations. Again, I'm Mitchell Warren, the director of AVAC, and we're delighted to welcome all of you here to this webinar to really look at both some historical precedents in the role of intellectual property and technology transfer in expanding access to global health technologies. And it's part history lesson, but it's mostly also a look forward of how we might do better as a global community with these approaches to products as new technologies, innovative technologies, enter the marketplace to address any number of global health issues. And as all of us reflect on the last 3 years of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, I think we all know we did not need another pandemic to teach us that technologies don't solve for inequities. And in fact, technologies can often exacerbate some of those very inequities that we know drive any number of global health challenges. We knew that in HIV, we've known it in tuberculosis, and COVID-19 really just proved that point again. I know many of you on the line are working in any number of coalitions around new approaches to thinking about both product development and future product delivery to get us to a better place where equity and impact are actually at the forefront of our minds, not just product development and profit making. And clearly the lessons from HIV and other longer existing pathogens and infectious diseases have taught us a lot of great lessons. And we have 4 terrific presenters today. We're going to talk about both some of the current conversations related to planning better for the future, as well as some of the really important historical precedents that we see in HIV and in other outbreaks and pandemics. Hopefully, we'll have the last half hour or so of this conversation to really talk together about how to actually build on those lessons and do better in the future. We have 4 relatively brief presentations, and all 4 presenters could take the next 25 minutes and give us remarkable insights on any one of these 4 topics. But we decided to give them each 8 minutes. This was done collaboratively in a participatory way, to have each of them give us a very quick snapshot of different perspectives so that we could really engage in a conversation. So I'm going to quickly tell you who we're going to hear from and about what, and then we'll go in quick succession to all 4 of them. And many of them need no introduction to this audience. The first is Fifa Rahman, who's had incredible experiences in global health, really looking at how to amplify civil society inputs and strategic engagement in doing better with product development and product delivery. She was formerly one of the NGO delegates on the UNIDAID board, so really knows about the essential work of equity embedded in developing and delivering products. Brooke Baker, who's a professor at Northeastern University School of Law and longtime analyst and advocate with HealthGap, who's really driven so many remarkable efforts across many areas of vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics, and very involved in what evolved over the last 3 years, is going to really focus in on some of the history of the experience. I'm next going to call on Fitsum Lakow from Wacky Health, and Fitsum sits in Addis Ababa and is the lead liaison for Wacky Health with the African Union, and has really spent the last several years thinking about and driving the conversations related to manufacturing and thinking about access, particularly for low and middle income countries, and thinking a lot about the role of the African Union and the African CDC, and really excited to have Fitsum here. And then finally, Esteban Barone, who leads policy strategy and market access at the Medicines Patent Pool. And I think we all know the MPP plays a really critical role in thinking about licensing and capacity development for manufacturing as well, and really amazing experiences with recently some of the COVID innovations, but also just last week, as many of you will know, the MPP announced sublicenses for injectable cabotegravir for PrEP. So really connecting the dots between HIV and COVID. So we're going to quickly go in succession in that order. And I'm going to first turn it over to FIFA to kick us off.
Thanks very much, Mitchell, for that introduction. I've been asked to quickly set the scene in terms of what we went through during COVID. I'm sure it's still fresh in our minds, so I'll be very, very quick. But I just wanted to start with diagnostics. And it's relevant, even though we're going to be talking about intellectual property for the platforms like GeneXpert. I wanted to set the global context in terms of why they were so important for folks in the global South. Some of this context is rooted in the fact that most of us in the global North had access to self-tests fairly early on in the acute phase of the pandemic. In the UK, for example, where I live, self-tests were available for free on the NHS starting April 2021. However, WHO's self-test guidelines came in March 2022, and in many countries in the global South, there still isn't access to self-tests. So during this time, PCR was incredibly important. And if you're interested in why self-tests were so late, that's a whole conversation for another day, quite an enraging conversation. But let's focus on the PCR, because they were incredibly important, especially automated PCR, which returns results in less than 2 hours. And there are many environments where people need quick results. In Somalia, for example, we spoke to WHO there, and there's a lot of nomadic populations who couldn't really afford to wait around for test results to come the next day or even in a few days. People needed it quickly. And of course, self-test would have been perfect for this. But in the absence of self-test, people needed automated PCR. In Madagascar, only 60% of people have access to primary healthcare. So for a lot of other people, it takes a minimum of 2 hours to get to a healthcare facility. So what you want is for tests to be quick and accurate. So in the picture top right, you've got a picture I took in Zimbabwe of an Alere machine that returns results in less than an hour and a half. And on the bottom, you have a Cepheid GeneXpert machine, of which there are 40,000 installed in over 180 countries. However, there are patents applicable to the GeneXpert machine as well as the Alere machines. And these are a couple of them that I've listed right here. As you can see, the patents for the cartridge expire in 2037, and the patents for the docking bays and data doors, which you can see in the picture there, expire in 2033. So the idea that that patents aren't important for diagnostics is incorrect. You will hear, and during COVID pandemic, we heard a lot of people say that patents really weren't applicable to access to diagnostics. So it's important that going forward, we dispel this myth and work on it for future pandemics. We're, of course, quite familiar with all of this nonsense. So Moderna, of course, at first said that they would waive patents. And later this changed. We know, of course, that Gavi's Seth Berkley didn't believe that IP mattered for access to vaccines. And of course, we know the massive failures of the COVAX in terms of not having a backup for the Serum Institute. And what happened is when the Serum Institute decided that it really needed to reserve its vaccines for the Indian population, that's when folks in other global South countries were particularly vulnerable and weren't able to access the vaccines. We know, of course, that high-income countries they conducted a lot of vaccine hoarding, and we know that today that's upwards of 10 doses per capita, and that it cost more than 1 million lives. And I wouldn't be surprised if this has gone even higher. Emerging out of this as well is the notion that, even if there were vaccines, the global South might not have taken them because they were all hesitant. So the next slide really is about showing you why this was incorrect. So the bottom picture is a picture thanks to UNICEF South Sudan, and we've got a case study coming up in one of our reports on gender and COVID that has a case study on South Sudan that dispels some of the hesitancy myths. But essentially, the idea that it was more of a hesitancy situation versus a supply or IP issue was horrifically incorrect. What people realize is when you bring vaccines into communities where they are going about their day, such as the Gudele market, people were suddenly not hesitant, right? And were able to take up the vaccines just because it was where they were every day. In addition, they conducted community engagement and just generally brought locations of vaccination centers and sites closer to the people. So the idea that it was hesitancy and not IP and not supply is a little bit crazy and maybe a little bit racist. We also learned that with Paxlovid, which of course the global North got a lot earlier than other people, that folks and by folks, I mean nurses and doctors did not know what it was. They didn't know what novel antivirals were. They didn't know what Paxlovid was. And this was in August 2022. This was much later than loads of countries in the global North, of course, had access to Paxlovid. And as this information emerged, we found a lot of people that were apologists for industry saying that, well, this is because domestic governments really didn't do their job in terms of communicating what Paxlovid was. There weren't listservs for professionals to communicate the existence of these technologies. But the fact is, perhaps they didn't communicate it because they knew it wouldn't come to them. And they knew it wouldn't come to them because it just would reach too late. So that's essentially a little bit of a background of what happened. And it clearly emerged from a global health architecture that was quite inequitable. And I'll stop here and happy to talk about anything more. And I'm sure my colleagues will cover different aspects that will contextualize this presentation even further. Thanks.
Ethan, thank you. That was a perfect introduction. And I'm going to hand it directly over to you, Brooke.
So thanks so much for this invitation. And I guess I'm going to take us through a bit of history. So pre-TRIPS, and TRIPS is a WTO agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights. And it's a 1995 treaty that basically instantiated or brought into existence the first international norms on intellectual property protection. And it included the key ones for medicines, patents, and trade secrets. But before the TRIPS agreement, countries had freedom internationally to tailor their intellectual property laws to prioritize access to affordable generic medicines. In over 50 countries pre-TRIPS, Several of them from Europe did not provide patent protection for pharmaceutical products in the decades preceding the TRIPS agreement. Unfortunately, most developing countries or low and middle income countries still had patent protections because of the legacy of colonial era laws. Basically, their colonial masters required them to adopt patent protections, particularly for products that were patent protected in the home, the master state. Developing countries, as they emerged from colonialism, mounted massive campaigns to try to achieve technology transfer, including technology transfer of pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity. And basically, the intellectual property industries and the high-income countries that supported those industries had a counteroffensive that was ultimately effective in the establishment of the TRIPS regime, which required, among other things, 20 years of protection for patents, and allowed, unfortunately, the imposition of such rules in virtually every country in the world except for least developed countries. So the status quo of patent protections under the TRIPS agreement and the colonial era patent laws was that pharmaceutical access was essentially available only to a small number of political and economic elites in LMICs. And the other 90+% of the population had to wait 20 years or more for affordable generic entry. So the price in economics terms is described as deadweight loss, a necessary cost of an intellectual property regime theoretically designed to incentivize research and development. But of course, activists measure the cost in terms of actual dead people. Deadweight loss for us means people who died unnecessarily because of the imposition of intellectual property monopolies. So the status quo for major infectious diseases, and indeed for non-infectious diseases as well, was the absence of medicines in low and middle income countries, with HIV antiretroviral medicines being a key example. There have been others before and since, but certainly treatments for MERS and SARS, the precursors of COVID-19. There was inequitable access for avian flu, treatments and vaccines more recently that we've heard about for Mpox, affordable medicines for hepatitis C, for newer regimens of tuberculosis. The list goes on and on. In terms of some more contemporary medicines, some of the newer higher tech medicines, monoclonal antibodies, 90% of the global population has only 10% of access to monoclonal antibodies, and Africa, for example, has only 1% access to MABs, despite its very large population. So leading efforts to override the status quo of intellectual property blockade of medicines to poor people in low and middle income countries arose in Southeast Asia, especially Thailand, Latin America, especially Brazil, and sub-Saharan Africa, especially South Africa. AIDS activists in Brazil succeeded in convincing their government in 1996 to adopt universal access to triple therapy, even as the US was exerting pressure on Brazil to prematurely adopt the TRIPS agreement, even though Brazil had a transition period until 2005. Because of Brazil's efforts, the price for ARVs was a quarter in Brazil of what they were in the global controlled market controlled by pharma. AIDS activists in Thailand sought compulsory licenses that would allow generic production of a first-generation antiretroviral and was eventually succeeding in allowing a generic product to come into Thailand. Activists in South Africa, who many of us know far more about, succeeded in joining forces with the government to oppose US trade sanctions and a lawsuit brought by 27 pharmaceutical companies and trade associations against the Mandela government because it was going to allow a parallel importation and presumably also consider compulsory license. On the heels of that campaign in South Africa, we had the Defiance campaign where generic fluconazole was imported from Thailand illegally and publicly. We had the Hazeltow competition case, which resulted in voluntary licenses that hugely expanded access to some key antiretrovirals throughout sub-Saharan Africa. and then a series of subsequent activist campaigns in South Africa, led by the now famous Treatment Action Campaign that I'm sure all of you have heard about. These country-led campaigns succeeded in forging an international coalition of access to medicine activists who recognized the need to focus on IP barriers and to insist on access to lower-cost antiretroviral products. Once the generic price offered by Cipla in India in 2001 dropped the price of a fixed-dose combination of the first-generation antiretrovirals from over $10,000 to $350 per person per year, the rollout of the treatment revolution in the global south was enabled. In other words, it was access to affordable generics that led the way to donors then giving, for the first time, really putting significant money on the table to purchase medicines and for countries to invest and roll out robust treatment programs. The result of this is that we've gone from a situation of 20,000 Africans on treatment at the turn of the millennium to 20 million Africans on treatment today, a 1,000-fold increase in the number of people who have access to life-enhancing and extending antiretroviral therapy. We have also, because of generic entry, we have succeeded beyond our imagination in lowering the cost of improved antiretroviral regimens. The antiretroviral medicines that cost $45,000 per person per year today in the United States are available for $45 per person per year in South Africa. 1,000th the cost, a tenth of a penny on the dollar price in the US. We've learned that the more generic companies that enter, the lower the price goes and the more secure supply. Although the original producer country was mainly India, we learned that it was vitally important to have distributed manufacturing in other regions of the world. And we also learned, somewhat to our chagrin in the COVID pandemic, that although it was quite easy to reverse engineer small molecule medicines and for generic producers to produce them at volume and at very low prices, the situation is much more complicated for vaccines and for the biologic medicines that are now increasingly important in the fight against diseases. So the AIDS revolution was achieved by activists in Thailand swimming across the river in Chiang Mai to disrupt US-Thailand free trade agreement negotiations in 2006 and 7. It was achieved by the Treatment Action Campaign, bringing 6,000 people to the first global march for treatment in Durban in 2000, chanting "Pills cost pennies, greed costs lives." It was accomplished by countless demonstrations for access against big pharma companies, their rich country defenders, and inactive country governments. It was accomplished by patent opposition procedures, by compulsory and voluntary license requests, by protests against free trade agreements, and many other activist campaigns. Even with this, millions of lives have been needlessly lost to HIV, to TB, to hepatitis C, and now, more recently, to COVID-19. Patents, trade secrets, copyrights, and industrial designs are a set of intellectual property monopoly rights that enable big pharma companies to profiteer off a disease and for poor people to largely die as a result. We will not accomplish what we need to accomplish in order to ensure access to affordable medicines in the future in response to future pandemics if we don't join this previous chain of fearless fighters, some of whom were beaten and arrested, but all of whom were committed to a single proposition. Everyone, everywhere, has an equal right to life-saving medicines, and nothing, most especially man-made intellectual property rules, must stand in the way. Thank you very much.
Brooke, thank you. Hearing you over many years, I'm so glad we recorded this. That was a remarkable history, but also a remarkable call to action. So thank you. And it's a perfect lead in to both Fitzim and then to Esteban in some next steps. So Fitzim, let me turn to you now, please.
Thank you very much. I hope you can see my screen.
We can.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction and also for the very wonderful presentations before me. They really helped me in setting the scene. So basically what I'll be doing is to share the local manufacturing capabilities of Africa, the challenges we have, and also the opportunities. And from there, I believe we can easily see why we need some support when it comes to the IP waiver and intellectual, the TRIPS waiver in terms of having access to these technologies. So local manufacturing of pharmaceutical products in Africa has been a topic on the table for long, and also for post-COVID, we have seen the need that there should be a kind of a very robust mitigation plan to really bring up to speed the African continent in terms of bridging the gap. So actually in 2005, there was the African Union decision that laid the foundation for pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa, which is also being underseen under the new Partnership for Africa Development, or known as the African Union Development Agency. So in 2012, the PNPA laid out a business plan and also a roadmap known as the AU Roadmap on Shared Responsibility and Global Solidarity. So it was mainly for AIDS, TB, and malaria response in Africa back then. Then in 2015, we had the Executive Council decision, which came up with the Africa Medicine Regulatory Harmonization Program, which also led to the birth of the Africa Medicine Agency. So the basic aim of the the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa is to really have an increased access to medical products and technologies. So what is the situation as we speak in Africa? Africa only contributes to the 3% global medicine production as we speak. Africa imports around 95% of the required medical products. We do have a very fragmented supply chain leading to high cost of medical products. The intermediary margin costs account for around 50%, and also for some African countries, it might even go higher, compared to between 2 to 24% of intermediary margins in OECD countries. As we speak, we only have 379 pharmaceutical manufacturers in the continent, and looking at their distribution, they are not even evenly distributed within the continent. We also have a very majority of the active pharmaceutical ingredients are still being imported from outside, and some manufacturing plants are all just limited to packaging. So the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan believes that there is a good political will, coherent policy among member states, and also sound sector strategy, we can achieve the goals stipulated on the plan. So to achieve that, it builds upon 6 pillars, which is the human resource development, access to product and technology, access to affordable finances, and time-limited initiatives, and also regulatory system strengthening and enforcement, partnerships, collaborations, and also fostering business linkages, and finally enhancing market data collection and facilitating market access. So we have the following key continental and regional initiatives. We have the AMRH and AMA. AMRH is the Africa Medicine Regulatory Harmonization Program, and the Africa Medicine Agency. These are regulatory systems. They are well placed within the African Union Commission, and AMA has been recently inaugurated in Kigali, Rwanda. We have the African Continental Free Trade Area program, which looks into local production of pharmaceuticals, and also looks into how we can link this into how we can link that as a priority in the value chain. We have the Africa Medical Supply Platform under the United Nations Economic Program. We also have the AFCFTA Pharma Anchored Initiative. There is also the Partnership for Africa Vaccine Manufacturing, which looks into producing 60% of the new vaccine for Africa in 2040. And we do have the Homegrown Solution Accelerator. So what are the challenges? Obviously, there is inadequate financing, and also there is also little incentive for private sector to join the local manufacturing or to be a pharmaceutical producer in Africa. There is problem in market access, and also there is high competition globally, especially from pharmaceutical producers from Asia, incoherent policies among member states, and also weak regulatory environments and inadequate human resources. So even within the human resources, there is also a migration that has been observed so far. So there is also within member states limited collective coordinated steps to achieve the vision of the pharmaceutical manufacturing plan, poor infrastructure, energy, internet, good road access and such. So these are the collective challenges we are witnessing as we go. So what are the opportunities in terms of taking advantage of the local, pharmaceutical manufacturing plan for Africa? We have the following initiatives: the Africa Medicine Agency, the African Continental Free Trade Area, Africa CDC, the AUDA, NEPAD, and also African Union Commission. These bodies are very instrumental in organizing policy dialogue among member states, creating also enabling environment for dialogue between private sector, civil society, and as well as other potential investors who want to take advantage of this. The other opportunities are few countries now are acquiring or attaining the maturity level 3 in terms of becoming listed WHO local authority. So far, we have 5 national regulatory agencies in Tanzania, South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Ghana. There is also an increased political will for local production, and this came as a result of the COVID-19 lessons. There is also the establishment of the Continental Application Program Interface Database, which are mainly going to be fed by the inputs that will come from the Africa Medicine Regulatory Harmonization and also the Africa Medicine Agency. Also, we have the private sector getting organized. We also have associations of private sector or local manufacturers, and we also had a very good meeting last year in October in Nairobi, Kenya, whereby we had the opportunity to listen from the private sector in terms of their interest, in terms of their challenges, and also what they expect countries to do in terms of really taking advantage of the private capital in Africa. We do also have the establishment of the pharmaceutical plan for Africa governance structure. Also now there are projects trying to link to these documents or the outcome documents of the governance structures of the Africa Regulatory Harmonization Plan. And there are also pilots happening in some regional economic communities such as ECOWAS. So there are also pooled procurement initiatives in some regional economic communities and continental level as well. And also preferential procurement guided by governments and partners. Here it's also important to mention some of the good practices that have been now been seen in some countries by PEPFAR and also Ministry of Health. So these are the current efforts that we see on the continent. There is the operationalization of the PMPA governance framework for effective coordination. We have the mapping and also making data available on investment opportunities, which is also now available within the African Union Development Agency. We have updated the compendium of good pharma policy and practices. There is investment in creating an enabling environment for pharmaceutical sector growth. There is also putting in place measures for leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Area. And there is the October dialogue, which I mentioned just one slide before on private sector engagement. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Great, Fitzim, fantastic. And want to make sure everyone is aware that in addition to the recording, we will post the slides on the web, because Fitzim, that was just a terrific primer on all the moving parts that you track so well at Wacky Health. And so that'll be a resource for all. And let me finally turn to our fourth presenter, Esteban Brune from the Medicines Patent Pool.
Yes, hello all. Are you able to see my slides? Could you confirm?
We can, yes, there you go. I was going to say, now it's in slide view.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, Mitchell, and thank you to AVAC and to the team for putting this together. I thought that for my presentation, I would really focus squarely on the question of the main title of the webinar, because I think that helps to guide some of the points I wanted to make. So why do we need agreements on IP and technology transfer? So just one word, this is who I am from the Medicines Patent Pool, or MPP. This is the mission of our organization. I'll focus simply on that second column there to point out that what we do is licensing and technology transfer. That is, we're a public health organization. We try to do is ensure there are affordable medicines or support the development of affordable medicines and other health technologies in low and middle income countries. We've been doing this since 2010, established by Unitaid at the time, and we continues to be a key funder of MPP, and started working on HIV and gradually expanded into other infectious diseases and non-communicable diseases. So why do we need licenses and technology transfer? I don't argue there are 5 key reasons why we need them or why we would want to have them. First is because they can facilitate price reductions. Secondly, accelerate access to new treatments or other health technologies. Third, because they enable greater volumes to be made. Fourth, because they contribute to supply security. And fifth, because they can support geographical diversification of manufacturing. So let me go through each one of these 5 points to illustrate it. So first point, license and technology transfer can facilitate price reductions. So as mentioned by Brooke earlier, patents generally last for 20 years from the date of filing. So during those 20 years, you only have an innovator, one manufacturer on the market, and that is the innovator. And generics cannot come in countries where there are patents unless a license is issued. So if you don't have licenses in place and there are patents in place, this is typically, and I've got a few examples of products for HIV and COVID, some still in the pipeline, like Lenacapavir, when the patent would expire. So if nothing else, if there were no licenses and there are patent in your country, there's a patent, then this is when, at best, you'd be expecting to see generics coming in. And you see a product like dolutegravir, which is now almost 20 million people in low and middle income countries are taking the generic versions of dolutegravir. And in practice, if there hadn't been licenses, potentially you would have to wait until 2026 for generics to come in, at least in those countries where there are patents. So they facilitate price reductions. Why? Because once you have, the license enables other manufacturers to come in. When you have those manufacturers, you have competition, and that is what brings the price down. Today, you can get a hepatitis C cure for 12-week treatment in over 100 countries for approximately $72 through the Global Fund, for example. And that's been coming down massively from thousands of dollars years back. And I'm showing an example of how it went down in relation to tenofovir as more and more generics came in, and how that drives down the price. So you can see that across all sorts of products. Once generics come in, price comes down. So if you have competition on several manufacturers, it comes down even further, and licensing can be an avenue to do that. The second point is because it accelerates access to new treatments. So of course, it's great the price comes down, but the key question is, does that mean people actually get access to the product? And what we're seeing repeatedly is that, yes, as the price comes down, that does have a significant impact, particularly for certain products where there is funding, where there is a diagnostic infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera. So of course, the price of the treatment is not sufficient for access to happen, but it is a key variable that can trigger a lot of other things to happen, contribute to ensuring, once you have a cheaper product that, and that is affordable enough, then you'll, invest you're more likely to invest in diagnosing, you're more likely to put in place other key steps that are required to ensure the product is accessed. And here you see uptake in dolutegravir as an example of that. Thirdly, because it enables greater volumes. So you need, if you're trying to supply a new medicine across the world to a large number of people, many of which in low and middle income countries, you may need significant volumes. And that's where having several manufacturers makes sense. In the case of dolutegravir, again, you have 13 licensed generic manufacturers who have developed the product and are supplying today, in 4 years, supplied 784 million packs, a significant number of treatments. And that's, again, something that if the more manufacturers you have, the more likely you're going to be able to supply large volumes that may be required if the product is one that is needed by millions of people, as in the case of HIV treatment. Fourthly, because a licensing and tech transfer contributes to supply security. So we often see there are stockouts or problems with the supply of certain medicines, or not enough of the product being made, and we saw that during COVID, not enough being made of certain products, at least initially to start off, and the licensing enables you to have additional manufacturers, and that can reduce the risk of stockouts and improve supply security. The fifth point is that it can support geographical, diversification of manufacturing, but particularly also to have more geographically diverse manufacturers. And this shows how at MPP, at least, we've been really over the last few years trying to make greater focus to enlarge the number of manufacturers from different regions that are able to manufacture the products we have licenses on. 14 in the case of the treatments, 14 manufacturers in 14 countries at the moment. And in the case of the mRNA technology transfer program that we're co-leading with WHO and working with 15 different country, vaccine manufacturers across 15 different countries. So again, through licensing, you can achieve that. When do we need technology transfer? So the licensing, of course, is simply a contract that enables a generic manufacturer to come in when there's a patent. Sometimes you need technological support to facilitate the development of that product. That may be particularly needed when you need that product really fast, so the tech transfer can accelerate the development, or when you try to build capacity of additional manufacturers that you're trying to bring to market. And that's in the case of, for example, the mRNA vaccine program. Here you can see the map with all the countries that we're working with to support the development of manufacturing capacity for mRNA vaccine. And again, also the third point is when we need to develop more complex products that where the manufacturers that may not have experience in relation to those products because they're new, they're more complex, and there again, technology transfer can be critical enabler for that. So how do we bring this all together? So in relation to, for example, an example that was mentioned earlier by Mitchell, recent license on HIV prevention tool, cabotegravir long-acting, that was, and just last week we announced the licensees that are going to be making or developing cabotegravir long-acting, which is a product originally developed by ViiV Healthcare. And there, of course, has been a significant call from a lot of groups and importance of getting access as soon as possible, and really advocating for the need to have licenses and generic manufacturers come in with more affordable product. That culminated in the license, ultimately then in sub-licenses to generic manufacturers who are now working on developing. So how does that contribute? How does this relate to the points I was making earlier? Well, it will enable greater volumes of the product being made because right now there are supply constraints. It will hopefully lead to price reductions, and in turn also that hopefully will also result in more people able to access. And there will be a technology transfer that will hopefully help to accelerate the development of that product. So really trying to, the 5 points I was making earlier, trying to bring it together through the example of cabotegravir long-acting. And finally, linking this to pandemic preparedness and response, how does, all those experiences in relation to HIV and some of those COVID medicines and hepatitis and other areas where licensing have played a role. I mean, in the context of COVID, what we need is, we want products to be developed rapidly, to become available as soon as possible globally. We want to have multiple suppliers across multiple regions that can supply large volumes of a quality product at affordable prices. So again, given those key points, the speed, the need for availability, accessibility, volumes, affordable pricing, etc., license and tech transfer can be a key mechanism to achieve that. And of course, you'd be surprised to see that in various discussions that are ongoing, such as in the pandemic treaty discussions, licensing, technology transfer get mentioned as potential enablers. I do want to say that an additional leverage point or important issue that arises in the context of health emergencies and pandemics is that there's often quite a significant public funding for the development of health products. And that really provides a unique opportunity to ensure that we have the right access provisions built in very early on, and that supporting or requiring licensing and tech transfer. That's something that's as you all probably know, it's part of the discussions that are ongoing now. How do we develop a pandemic preparedness and response architecture that caters for broader access than was the case earlier. Thank you very much, and to all of you, and really also want to thank our funders for supporting our work. Over to you, Mitchell.
Fantastic. Esteban, thank you, and Fitzim and Brooke and FIFA for spectacular presentations. I am delighted to turn over to my colleague, Samantha Rick, picking up on exactly where you ended, Esteban. How does this lead into pandemic preparedness, prevention, and response? Sam manages our PPPR work and multilateral engagement and is going to facilitate the conversation here.
Great. Well, I know we have limited time, so I'll just jump right in with some of the questions that we've got prepared. A reminder to everyone who is participating, please, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A section and we'll try to make sure they get answered. Firstly, I'd love to, Fitzim and FIFA, can you talk about the ways in that the responses have or haven't been inclusive of low and middle income country experiences? Whoever starts talking first gets to go first.
So yeah, I'll come in. So let's start in the ACT Accelerator, because the evaluation on the ACT Accelerator clearly found that LMICs hadn't been engaged enough. And this was despite throughout the ACT Accelerator in almost every facilitation council, I kept saying, we need equal intellectual partnership of LMICs, which meant we needed technical experts with LMIC passports in the working groups that we were involved in. And a lot of folks I spoke to, predominantly Global North friends who were working in this field, inevitably thought it was some kind of tokenistic gesture or representation, diversity kind of situation, which it is, but it really is more about the efficiency of how you want global pandemic response to go, right? And an example is when DRC returned its doses to the COVAX. Turns out no one, despite there being a VIRAT tool, the vaccine readiness tool conducted by both the WHO and COVAX, nobody knew why provincial health leadership had not been engaged. Nobody had engaged community health workers that had been mobilized in the Ebola response. There was a real lack of this technical and contextual information that was needed to deploy vaccines. And the reason for that is you didn't have any Black and brown people from the global South in the room, right? And that continues to happen in the medical countermeasures prototype working group, which I represent CSOs in, right? And it's not about just representation in the room. It's also about the kind of language that you use. And some of the language that we're coming out from the prototype working group is that they want to come up with a minimum viable product for future pandemics. We really need to make language more accessible in order to involve people who speak 3 or 4 languages, right? We can't just all assume that everyone speaks BCG speak, right? So there are a number of ways that we need to include and really value and respect the global South technical expertise, and that's currently not being done, and it hasn't been done in the ACT Accelerator.
Fitzim, you want to jump in on this? Are you still with us, Fitzim? I know that Fitzim is having some internet connectivity issues.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you. To be honest, there's not much to add on what Dr. FIFA has mentioned. Just to further strengthen that, maybe I'll go into, there should be a recognition of also institutions, global South institutions such as the Africa CDC, the African Medicine Agency, and also the programs and policies that we have put in place, our roadmaps, our frameworks, because those build on our context, and usually context is left out of the equation when looking or addressing some of the gaps we have. So the technical expertise, the human resource, looking into also the infrastructure gaps we have, we really need to kind of accept those limitations and also try to work in addressing them. So the question should come also from the global South, and also the response should not be dictated in a way that will not address the problem. So that is one. The other one is also Africa needs also to build into its traditional medicine wealth. Maybe this might be out of context, but what I want to bring this is that there has been a lot of achievements in traditional medicine in other parts of the world. And in Africa, when you see those, there is a limited access towards traditional medicine, or sometimes you would see over-dependence on traditional medicine. That was the case in some communities during the onset of COVID-19. And there is also the other extreme, which don't really look at traditional medicine as viable. So we need also to bridge that gap whereby you can have the traditional medicine as part of, once approved, once also given that they are viable to be part of the current modern health practice on the continent. So just to supplement the points Dr. Fifa raised. Thank you. Back to you.
Great, thank you. We have one question from Alan. He says, Brooke spoke on the opposition to IP reforms from the global north in the pharmaceutical industry during the HIV pandemic. And what are the practical strategies from CSOs and communities in that fight that need to be adopted in the PPR mechanisms that are now being set up?
Okay, and thanks. And there's a related question on compulsory licenses. So, you know, I think the history that I described was activists basically not willing to accept the IP maximalist status quo. Basically saying, no, monopolies are not the way to deal with medicines. Poor people can't wait 20 years or more for access to life-saving medicines, certainly not so in a pandemic. So compulsory licenses, you know, patents are granted by governments with a limited period of exclusivity, but they always come subject to the country's right to allow generic production, as long as there's some minimum remuneration to the patent holder for the generic being able to do so. And that's a right that's enshrined within the TRIPS agreement, and it's enshrined to a greater or lesser extent in virtually every intellectual property law at the national level around the world. And so countries, even when a big pharma company gets a patent, they get it on the condition that it might later be reduced, the monopoly might be reduced to allow generic production. And that is through what's called compulsory licenses or government use licenses. And you know, one of the comments I put in the chat earlier is, you know, the medicine patent pool has done a tremendous job to address access for a significant portion of people living with HIV, for example, approximately 90% of adults and 98+% of children. But there are some countries always excluded. And for some of the other diseases, even a higher percentage of the population are excluded. And those are upper middle income countries. And so the solution that's going to, and also MPP licenses don't cover all medicines and sometimes come later in the game. So we didn't have any MPP licenses on COVID vaccines, for example. So we need other mechanisms. We need a stick as well as a carrot. We need to actually be able to force companies not only to override the patent rights, but also to have access to data, have access to know-how, trade secrets, and confidential information. And this needs to be built into the new global framework. There's a lot of effort by the US, Europe, and other rich countries to focus on voluntary measures only, and to suggest that solutions like company-controlled tiered pricing is an adequate solution. Well, the tiered price for Paxlovid in upper middle income countries is over $250 per person per year, much higher on a per capita basis, income basis in middle income countries than it is in the US. And so, you know, I think we need to think about, you know, the forceful efforts that are needed by all of us, those in rich countries against rich country governments and against companies. Those in developing countries and low middle income countries, the efforts can be taken at the national level. There is a provision in the TRIPS agreement that would allow any country in the world to override all of its intellectual property rights during the COVID pandemic, and no country used it. Article 73 of the TRIPS agreement. Very few countries issued compulsory licenses, even though they had a right to do so, and 3 such efforts are still pending. There was some patent law reform in Brazil that made compulsory licensing easier, but there's still much more to be done. And so my call to people who are listening is, we need to mount campaigns, not just at the international level for a pandemic treaty that may or may not directly address intellectual property. We need to wage campaigns in developing countries for countries to use the flexibilities that they have, the involuntary solutions they have at hand. And we need campaigns in rich countries to tell them to get off low and middle countries' backs and to quit threatening them every time they try to use such flexibilities.
Great. Thank you so much, Brooke. I have one question for Esteban. Some of the reactions to the most recent license was surprised that there were no African manufacturers. Can you talk about MPP's strategy with any African manufacturing and any challenges that you faced in getting African manufacturers to apply for these opportunities?
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Sam. We've recently announced the 3 licensees for cabotegravir long-acting. So these are 3 manufacturers who are going to be able to develop generic versions. They're going to be supporting that process and will hopefully be coming to market over the next few years. Of the 3 manufacturers, all 3 are primarily based in India. One of them has indicated plans to manufacture in South Africa. I think the challenge we're facing is one that we've been facing, over the years, which is that we can only give licenses to the companies that apply for obtaining them, and we've been doing a lot of outreach to really try and encourage manufacturers from around the world to apply for our licenses. That has worked better for certain products than for others. In the case of molnupiravir, for example, there was quite a significant, because it's quite a simple molecule to make. There were several manufacturers who came forward really interested in making that product. In the case of cabotegravir long-acting, that was a lot less the case, and that's probably because it's a very complex injectable nano formulation, which makes it a lot more complex to make. Most of the companies don't have experience in developing those kinds of formulations, and we're only going to be able to give out 3 licenses. And so there's probably the realization that wasn't a product that they were likely going to be able to develop in rapid time. And what we were looking for is manufacturers that can really develop as fast as possible. And so we zoomed in on the 3 manufacturers who are most ready and more likely to be able to develop rapidly to address the demand that exists already now today. But I do think as a general strategy, that's the direction we're going in, and we've really made an effort during COVID and will continue to do that, is to adapt the criteria for giving licenses in order to enable manufacturers who are maybe going to be catering for a small number of countries in the license to get licenses, local and regional manufacturers. And I think that's been critical, and that's something that I think a lot of the global health organizations are now waking up to, with following what happened with COVID, trying to broaden, not just depending on a few manufacturers largely based in a couple of countries, but really trying to broaden that manufacturing base as much as possible.
Thanks so much for that, Esteban. And then we have one question in the chat, which I think would be a great place to end on. I know there's been such a rich discussion. There's lots going on here. But Dingen Mithi, I think, asks, what's the role of media and civil society in pandemic preparedness and response now? How can we hold powerful pharma accountable? And we all know how powerful they can be and are good at holding intellectual property. It can be hard to lobby for patent waivers. So what are the role of civil society and communities in that fight?
To put it briefly, if we don't join the fight, we won't win. I mean, we already see in the pandemic accord negotiations that the European Union is joining Big Pharma in espousing voluntary measures and tiered pricing as the primary response to the need for expanded manufacturing and lower prices. If we accept that kind of solution, we will have basically what we experienced in COVID. Rich countries will get preferential access to initial supplies. They'll pay higher prices. They'll hoard quantities. And then if there's anything left over, they may trickle down to poor countries at the end. And so, I think we have to learn the lessons from COVID-19 of the failed response and the status quo response to intellectual property. Actually, it wasn't even status quo because of the public investments in research and development for the COVID tools was massive. And yet it didn't come with strings attached. So we can demand that high-income countries that fund R&D put strings on their R&D agreements that require technology transfer and licensing. We can further demand that the high-income countries, which always get served first, not stand in the way of poor countries that always get served last. I mean, that status quo is just completely unacceptable. And we have to say to Big Pharma, $90 billion in profit off of COVID-19 in 2 years is too much. That's 3 times what was spent on the ACT Accelerator to try to encourage, to achieve access to medical countermeasures in low and middle income countries. So if we don't join the fight, if we don't lead the fight, if we don't take leadership from countries in the global south in that fight, we are going to lose. But I also do want to remind us again that we can have country campaigns as well as international campaigns. I would not put all our eggs in the basket of the medical countermeasures platform and the pandemic accord and the international health regulations agreements, because in all of those forums, the European countries and the US and Switzerland all have big voices and essential veto power. And are they going to give up their support for the companies that give them preferential access? That's a fight we really need to wage.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment on this? I know FIFA has a lot of experience in organizing CSOs.
Yeah, I didn't want to come in on that, but I'll come in on some of the questions in the Q&A. So one of the questions in the Q&A is how can we combat myths about vaccine hesitancy and lack of capacity in response to low uptake of COVID vaccines in LMICs? And we can do that by citing some of the examples in my presentation, but there are also some others. So a lot of people had legitimate questions about the vaccine that hadn't been adequately communicated through campaigns, and this is a much neglected area of the COVID response was investment in context specific and non-condescending communications campaigns that went through the channels that people needed. And in some countries, this was radio. In other countries, this needed messaging through community health workers who people trusted. In some countries, for example, health workers haven't been paid for ages, and for that reason, people really distrusted their government. So when their government started to send out vaccine messaging, they were like, well, you can't even pay me on time. Why should I trust you on vaccines? So, the idea that people are just stupid is incorrect and insulting, right? And there are so many examples. In South Sudan, for example, contextually, a lot of women still need to ask men for permission to leave the house and to access healthcare. So the idea that these women are hesitant is inaccurate and intellectually lazy. We need to look at the context and the reasons why people are not accessing vaccines. It's kind of easy to say, oh, okay, people are hesitant without looking at the reasons as to why people aren't accessing vaccines. And sure enough, in South Sudan, when vaccination sites were decentralized and brought to where women were, women did take the vaccine. So lots of ways and lots of examples to combat hesitancy.
Thank you. I think we're 5 minutes over time, so we want to let people go. Thank you all for participating. We will connect anyone that wants to be connected. I just put my email in the chat. There seems to be clearly a lot of interest in this issue. And if people want to be connected or didn't get their questions answered, please email me. And Mitchell has included some links to some of our resources. One, our position paper from AVAC on PPR issues, and another of a podcast episode that we just put out last week that talks about these issues as well and how they're coming into play in different global negotiations. Anyone have any last words, particularly Esteban and Fitzum, since you didn't get to speak on those last questions?
Well, yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Fitzum, go ahead. No, please.
Okay, just to add a few points. As civil society, there's a lot we could do, and I believe we have also witnessed a very good civil society movement, especially given the context of the Global Fund for Southern Replenishment, whereby African civil societies were very instrumental in knocking doors of G7, G20 countries, trying to really see the accountability. So we can follow the same direction because we have missions, international missions in our respective countries, and we can leverage on those international missions by which going and also addressing the key issues, because the governments and also other agencies can do that, but as civil society, I believe we have the power jointly supported by the media. So we need to really be on those planned, organized missions to really see how we can take advantage of such international agreements. Back to you.
Esteban, go ahead.
Just a very quick point to say, don't underestimate the power and the capacity that the community and the civil society groups can have. And I think Cabo Tegre Long Acting has been a good example of that, how strong push, united, working together can really make things move. And so I would really say, one can despair and think, oh, the imbalance of power, but one can also see that, in fact, a lot of change can happen when there is a strong advocacy, and people, often do end up listening when that happens. And so, yeah, just wanted to end perhaps on that positive note. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And thank you everyone for joining. I know we went over time, but I'll let everyone go now. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Take good care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.